hard to build a big business if you don't have a big, end addressable market. Margin is your ability to make mistakes, right? And if you already start out with a low margin, very competitive market, then you don't have a lot of room to make mistakes and you don't have money. I think of it in terms of like, what would it take for this company to get to 100 million in revenue? I want to understand the thought process that you took to get there, right? Not the, hey, I saw this thing, or I read about this thing over here and I thought, oh yeah, we can like copy and paste this over here. We want to think of every stage of financing as proving something, de-risking something in the business.
Welcome back to Understanding VC. I'm your host, Rahul. Understanding VC is a perpetual MBA on a single subject, venture capital. Today, I'll be having an in-depth conversation on the importance of seeing big markets with Shiyan Koh. Shiyan is a co-founder and managing partner at Hustle Fund, a VC firm that invests in pre-seed software startups in the US, Canada, and Southeast Asia. And also, one quick note. Are you looking to refresh your digital presence? Digital Prism, the Singapore-based digital transformation expert sponsoring this episode, has a fantastic offer. The first 10 listeners to contact them get 20 free consultation hours. Just mention Rahul sent you. Also learn more from the link in the show notes. Now let's talk to Shiyan. Hi Shiyan, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so our topic of discussion today is, seeing the importance of seeing big markets, something that I'm very personally interested to discuss with you. So why do you think this is important, identifying big markets?
Well, I think in general, people who want to raise venture money want to build big businesses. It's hard to build a big business if you don't have a big, end addressable market. And often, I think, we talked about this a little bit before, is people get so excited about an idea, they just start going and they don't sort of take the time to stop and think about like, hey, is there actually a big enough opportunity for me here that if I were going to spend 4 to 6 years of my life pursuing this idea, I can actually get the kind of outcome that I want. And I think this is important specifically on the topic of venture-backed, venture-scale businesses. Of course, if you want to build any business and you're passionate about solving that problem, you should go do that. But I think that's a different question from saying, I want to raise venture money and I think I want to go get a 100x outcome. And so you can think about it. If I want to get a 100x outcome, I need to be pretty sure that there is a path for me to, say, get to 100 million of revenue within 5 to 7 years. And obviously, you're not going to own 100% of the market, right? Yeah. So then let's say you even optimistically own 10% of the market. Is there $1 billion market for the thing that you're solving? Or ideal, some people, they're always like, my addressable market is everybody in the entire world can use this. It's, multi-trillion-dollar market. I only need to own 0.0001% of it and I can still do it, which is a bit ridiculous. But, I think that's the kind of idea, which is like, is there even a big enough opportunity? And I think it can be useful to think about that before you start committing time, energy, resources to pursuing an idea.
Yeah. And what percentage of founders you come across actually think about this?
That's a great question. I think a lot of people tend to justify their decision after they've made it. So everyone...
I was that.
Everyone like has the same slide where you're like, the TAM is huge. And they all have the same like forecast slide. And I forecast, I'm going to do this hockey stick growth. But I think second time, repeat founders, I think often do it because they might have made a mistake the first time around.
Yeah.
I think people who might have worked in very competitive industries often think about it. And so I think apart from market size, there's also market dynamics. And so I think if you talk to a lot of people who maybe cut their teeth in e-com, they sort of come out of it and say, there's no way I'm starting another business in e-com.
Because you can't beat Amazon.
Well, margin is your ability to make mistakes, right? And if you already start out with a low margin, very competitive market, then you don't have a lot of room to make mistakes and you don't have money, right?
Yeah.
So, I think you're trying to find places where you have room to make mistakes and you have a big opportunity. And so I think those are the types of founders you tend to see who have spent more time thinking about the market. Is like, I was in a market situation where every day I felt like I was fighting for my life. And those who are like, hey, I spent 5 years building this thing, but what I learned was there actually wasn't a big enough opportunity there. And so I sold it or, I exited to other founders and, then my next go around, I really want to try to build something big.
Yeah. So as a VC, like, but how do you define a big market? Is there a number?
I think of it in terms of like, what would it take for this company to get to 100 million in revenue?
Okay.
And so you can back into that, right? Which is like, are you selling 100K ACVs?
Okay.
Then do I think there are enough businesses who can pay 100K ACV that you can go capture a percent of that, right? Or you're saying I'm selling some subscription $10 a month. How do I back into 100 million? Like, do I think that's a reasonable number? And I don't think this is a precise science because often people are attacking markets that don't already exist or are in the earliest stages. And so you might say, for example, I think there's all these famous quotes that they always publish, it's like, oh, when the first PC came out, right? Like, who wants a personal
5 people.
computer, right?
Yeah.
Like, how many people would ever, and you never imagine, oh, the cost of the PC is going to go down, plus the utility of the PC is going to go up. And so that actually increases the size of the market, right? And so you can kind of like picture that. Or even the iPhone, right? I think when the iPhone came out, everyone's like, this is a really bad phone. It, you know, BlackBerry has a better keyboard. There's all these other things that are better, but they never thought about like, oh, the App Store and the ecosystem and how that would drive demand and all these other sort of attendant factors. And so it is more art than science. But I do think that you have to kind of squint a little bit to think about, hey, are there so many people that want this that if I can make it work, um, everyone will buy it, right?
Yeah.
Like if I told you instead of saying like, look at this iPhone, I think the first iPhone that came out was probably like $1,000,
Yeah.
right? If I was like, hey, you can have a super powerful computer in your pocket, you can talk to anyone, you can play games, you can take photos, and it's going to cost you $200. Would you want it? How many people would want that? I think that's like an easier kind of thing. So you can't look at the exact thing that the founder is pitching you today. You have to try to use your imagination to say, if all these things go right in their business, is there possibly a big opportunity here?
Yeah. So, I've seen the founder of Shopify talk about his experience of running into a VC. Years later, he rejected Shopify. So the reason for rejection was that, there are not enough businesses that would want an e-commerce store. But then actually, e-commerce, Shopify solved a problem for a lot of businesses to a point where like new people want to create an e-commerce store.
Yeah.
It's similar to what you said about iPhone, right?
Yeah. So I think that's part of the art process is like trying to figure out like how big that can be.
Yeah.
And so it's a combination of like the size of the market, but then I think there's also the competitiveness of the market and what are things that benefit startups versus things that benefit incumbents, right? So I think the aphorism is always like, does the startup get distribution before the incumbent gets innovation? And I think, with this recent AI boom, you've really seen incumbents push out AI features at a really high rate.
Yeah.
And so even though tons of AI startups are raising lots and lots of money, I think there's still an open question about whether or not, and obviously we're like, well, what's the market size on intelligence? Like if you believe the cost of intelligence is going to go down, right? Which I think we all believe.
Yeah.
Like the market size on that is even hard to calculate. It's hard to even imagine, right?
Yeah.
But you still have to do the work to build the products, to get it into people's hands, to turn it into economic benefit to people, and that costs money. And so, I think market size is just one part of the underwriting question that VCs are trying to ask themselves as they make investment decisions.
Yeah. So what is your process like when your specific process when you come across?
Yeah. So when I meet companies, typically, you get on a call for the first meeting and most people have a deck, but my preference is normally to talk more casually rather than, march through a presentation. And where I like to start with folks is just to tell me why Like, this is the market question, right? Like, why'd you pick this problem?
Yeah.
Right. And I think it's always interesting because there's opportunity cost, right? Like, if you're doing this, it means you're not doing something else.
Yeah.
And so you must think this is the best use of your time. And I want to understand the thought process that you took to get there, right? Not the, hey, I saw this thing,
Yeah.
or I read about this thing over here and I thought, oh yeah, we can like copy and paste this over here. Like, I really want to understand what that thought process is, because you're going to be in a business relationship with these people if you do the investment for the next 10 years. And so hopefully they have a strong thought process and they have some insight. So part of the like, why are you doing this is also the, tell me what you learned as you talk to potential customers, right? Like, how did this problem uncover itself for you? And what insights have you gleaned along the way that give you the confidence to say, hey, I'm going to go build something to solve this in a way that other people can't do, or,
Yeah.
can't easily do. Like, what is that about it, right? And so they kind of go through that. And I'm always really interested in that customer experience. So, like, okay, who's the buyer? What is on their mind right now when they're facing this problem? What other alternatives have they considered to solve their problem? And, the best is when they're like, oh, well, today the buyer solves their problem with some sort of process that involves a fax machine or like pieces of paper, something horribly inefficient. And they're still doing it because that's the only thing that they know. And you guys are going to come in and, you know, make it mobile, make it easy, whatever it is, faster, cheaper, better, that kind of thing. I think that's like the sort of prototypical type of thing. And then we will go and dig in and talk about um, what that conversation sounds like with that customer. Like, well, so you told me you've done 100 customer interviews, right? Like, when you went and pitched this idea or you showed them some prototype, like, what did they say? What were their questions? What were their concerns, right? You're trying to get into the head of that buyer. And then I want to know, for the people who said no to you, why did they say no? Right?
Yeah.
So you can kind of try to understand that go to market sales motion. And then we'll dig into unit economics, right? How are you thinking about pricing? Why? How much does it cost you to serve that thing? Um, and try to understand, like, obviously it's early days, right? We're pre-seed investors. So a lot of these things aren't dialed in. They'll have some semi-arbitrary pricing. They don't really know what CAC is.
Yeah.
But at least you kind of want to just see how they think about it, and have they thought about what it should look like in some ideal end state. Um, I think people in region are getting better about this. I think 5 years ago, maybe, when there was a lot easier to raise money, I think people were very growth oriented and did not really look at unit economics as much, or they always kind of made the assumption that, like, at scale it'll be better.
That is.
But I think that they kind of let themselves off the hook a little bit in trying to think about, like, is this the right customer? Is this a good customer? Sure, I'm growing top line, but if I'm losing money on every customer, like, that's not a great long-term situation to be in. And so, something we talk about with founders is like firing your customer, right? Because at the beginning, you have a theory on who your customer is, so you kind of like sell to a bunch of people, but then you need to take the step to do analysis to be like, okay, I thought my customer was the SME, at least 50 employees, but when I look at the data, actually, my best customers are 150 employees and up. The sub 50 employee company is actually a terrible customer, right?
Yeah.
They are high cost to serve, way more tickets. They
Low
cost me more.
retention.
Yeah. And so actually, I should raise pricing on them, fire them, right? Like, either move my cost structure to match the type of customer they are, or fire them. And I should really focus my sales team or my marketing team on this segment that I actually know to be profitable. And I think that's a periodic review exercise that you constantly have to do, just to make sure that you are being honest with yourself about, hey, who is a good customer for me? Yeah, so we'll go through unit economics, and then we'll go through the team, right? So we'll talk about, like, hey, how'd you pick your co-founder? Where'd you guys meet?
Yeah.
How do you split responsibilities? How are you thinking about building out this team? Who are the next sort of 2 or 3 hires that you have on your list? Do you have candidates? Do you know who you'd want to work with? And I think the best signals are around, like, oh yeah, I've got 2 or 3 people in the, waiting room. We used to work together at my old company. They're ready to jump on board once I raise the round and I can pay them, but they've been working for sweat equity so far. They helped us build our MVP or something. I think all those are, like, good signals around, like, someone being thoughtful about building out their team.
Yeah.
Um, and then I think the other thing we talk about is, like, well, what's the roadmap, right? Like, okay, let's say you raise this round, 500K, $1,000,000, whatever it is. What is important to you to prove with this money? Like, what do you wanna get done? And sometimes people will say things like, "Oh, I'm gonna spend half of it on engineers and 25% on marketing," and I was like, "Okay, that's fine, but what do you wanna validate to
Outcome.
yourself? What is the outcome we want?" And we wanna think of every stage of financing as proving something, de-risking something in the business, right? And I want the founders to think that way because maybe you added revenue, but it was bad revenue, so you didn't prove anything, right? Maybe you hired 5 engineers, but you didn't prove anything other than you can spend money on 5 engineers, right? So I think trying to dial in on, like, what you wanna get done in this round that is gonna de-risk this business for you is a really important thing for founders to be able to articulate to themselves, right? Like, it's back to the opportunity cost question, which is like, if I'm gonna spend the next 18 months of my life on this, what do I need to prove to myself that this is worth my time, right? That my thesis about this business is correct. And so we talk a little bit about roadmap and how is this round gonna go? And then I try to get a sense of prioritization. So the problem with startups is there's just always like a million things to do.
Yeah.
And there's never enough time to do it. And the fact of the matter is only 1 or 2 things in your startup are existential. Everything else, if it's not 100%, it'll probably be fine, right? But it's not like, okay, your startup failed because you didn't get the color right on your logo, right?
Yes.
Or something like that. And so I asked them, what are, at the end of the year, right? So like right now we're in the end of June, right? So let's say we're just meeting right before Christmas. What is the one thing, 1 or 2 things that you absolutely would be thrilled to have accomplished? And so you try to, and then, sometimes people try to tell you 10 things and you're like, no, 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 you're not gonna be able to do 10 things. Just 1 or 2 things. And so you're just trying to get a sense of like how good they are at prioritizing what really matters to the business. And then I think the last thing, we try to dig in on is like, well, what's the dream?
What is opportunity?
Like,
Best case scenario. What
best
happens?
case scenario, everything goes right. What does this business look like?
Yeah.
Because I think sometimes in the beginning you get really in the weeds, you're like super tactical, which is great because you've got to get things done. But if we're gonna believe there's a big outcome, like, how is the world different? How is the world better because you succeeded? Like, what did you succeed in actually doing, right? And it isn't that, like, you made a bunch of money. That's a byproduct of succeeding and delivering a lot of value, hopefully. So I think that is something founders often struggle with too, which is like, well, how do I tie my thesis together to, like, a bigger picture? What happens if I succeed? And give people confidence that I can actually go do that thing. Because I mean, most of it sounds insane, right? Most of it's just like, "You wanna do what? Like, why?" But I think that's kinda part of the fun
Yeah.
of things.
So what are some of the mistakes that you've really heard from founders where they are like maybe overestimating the opportunity?
I mean, I don't know whether it's necessary that they overestimate the opportunity and it's more that it's gonna take way longer and it'll be way harder than you think it is, and you're gonna run out of money before you get there. And so, like, a common one is fintech or anything finance related. People always try to make the math work with cross sell. They're like, okay, I have this initial product and I'm gonna give it away free, or it's gonna be like super cheap, whatever it is. But to make the LTV number work, once they're using my app regularly, I'm gonna cross sell them all these other things. And we know that all these other things, financial institutions will pay big money to acquire like credit card, loan, blah, blah, blah customers. And they underestimate how hard it is to actually cross sell. Like cross sell is actually a hard thing. But they put in their Excel model and then they added it all. And they're like, oh, great. It totally works. So I think that's like they underestimate how hard cross sell is. think if you've never done marketing, you can often underestimate how hard marketing is because everyone's like, "Oh, I'll just go viral on TikTok or I'll use Facebook ads or whatever it is," right?
Yeah.
And those are tactics. Everyone uses them, but you don't have that much money. You actually don't have that great an idea who your customer is yet. So you can actually burn a lot of money serving ads to people who aren't going to convert.
Yeah.
And that's part of you trying to figure out what it is, right? But marketing is another thing. It's like it takes longer, it costs more than you think it's going to take. And so that's like another thing where it's like, oh, the conversion isn't reasonable for what you think it's going to do. And as a startup, cash is rarely your advantage, right?
Yeah.
So that's not a dimension you're going to win on. Like you can spend money, but everyone's going to spend money. So you need to think of some other way to win on that dimension. Um, Enterprise sales. I think if you've never done enterprise sales before,
Long
it
cycle.
always takes longer.
Also, something that you mentioned, the dynamics, specifically going back to fintech or insurtech, the incumbents already own all the most profitable customers.
Yeah, so that's an interesting one, right? Because I think it depends on the market. So I think like in developed markets, I think it is often true that incumbents own the most profitable customers because they've shed the unprofitable ones, right?
Yeah.
Like there's a reason why
Yeah, they
subprime
don't care.
customers don't have a lot of choices because they don't make money and so why would we make products for them? I think that is less true in emerging markets because incumbents in emerging markets have generally been more protected from competition. And so they wound up serving like higher income customers, but there's actually a whole class of perfectly creditworthy and good customers that are unserved or underserved before you even hit the like lowest, like
Yeah.
bad credit, unbanked, whatever. And so I think there is opportunity in emerging markets for fintechs. Um, but it does go back to this question of like, do you know who your customer is and how do you tell? Um, and so my background's in personal finance, and we always, I think it's an interesting thing to learn where someone who searches for the search term credit card is a bad credit. Someone who Googles the search term best credit card is a good credit.
Nice.
And that makes sense if you thought about it, right? Which is that if you are searching for best credit card, it means you actually have choices. You're trying to decide amongst a range of credit cards, and you only have choices because you have a good credit score, right? If you're just Googling any old random, who's going to give me credit? Any old random credit card, you probably have bad credit.
Yeah.
And, the LTVs associated with those two segments are pretty different. But I think that you have to figure out what the analogous sorting criteria are for emerging markets to figure out like, sometimes people are like, oh, iPhone user versus Android user. iPhone users are higher credit. But there's all these other things that people are trying to use to build alternative credit profiles to figure out like who are better customers or worse customers. But yeah, I think there's still opportunity in emerging markets to serve credit-worthy people who are unbanked or underbanked, but you still have to be careful there.
Yeah.
I think the one interesting thing about emerging markets is often digital acquisition is not the cheapest way to acquire people. So I was in Bangladesh earlier this year, and I heard this. I mean, it was such a weird fun fact. In Bangladesh, even though there is quite high mobile penetration, people often share phones in a family.
Phones.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so digital targeting often doesn't work very well because multiple people are using the same phone. And so a number of startups, they hadn't been seeing ROI from digital acquisition through like a Facebook or an Instagram. They actually set up physical sales centers and they got much better return on ad spend of like a physical sales center for what outside of the capital city, like in tier 2, tier 3, because people are used to buying things that way.
Yeah.
With a physical interaction. Um, Real estate's not that expensive, labor's not that expensive, and you can sign people up. But I was like, oh, yeah, I mean, it'd be crazy, right? If you're coming from a developed world social media marketing, you wouldn't necessarily be like, "Oh, I thought I was marketing to a teenage girl, but why did this middle-aged man pick up the phone?"
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
kind of thing. So, yeah, I think people have to kind of think about their channels and the efficacy of it and be willing to kind of think out of the box there.
Yeah. And see, one of the things that you mentioned during your assessment is looking at the customer experience, right?
Yeah.
This is maybe I'm interpreting this wrong. So VCs often talk about product, team, and the market,
Yeah.
and often the preference is the least for the product. They say it's more important to bank on the team and also look at the market. But it's often that product that really makes a difference, right? Like that the experience. I remember the first time I went to stay in an Airbnb. That was an experience. Only then you really understand that okay, there is an opportunity here.
The product is, I think, related a little bit to the team's orientation around the customer, right? And back to, like, understanding who your customer is, um, like, do you understand your customer at the sort of, like, slide level, or do you understand them in, like, I know what kind of clothes they wear, I know what music they listen to, like, I understand this customer level. And so, I think that teams that are very close to their customers will build better products because they'll be able to discern what is your customer really saying or not saying, and and they'll instrument their product to measure that, and they'll really get through to, like, okay, well, what's the thing that actually is helping that person make a decision? I don't want to overweight product in that. I think product and engineering people, product engineering founders are biased towards product as a lever, and product is important but not sufficient, right? Because you still need distribution. But I think product is one of those things where what is delightful about this that, is convinces someone that they should even try a new thing, right? Like, what if it's just gonna be like a frustrating experience, then why bother?
I think okay. And as example, this is I'm quoting Jason Calacanis here. He says that he was. This is in reference to Calm meditation app. That best products induce a market to manifest itself. He was basically saying that at that point when they were building that app, there's no market for meditation. Nobody paid for meditation apps. Then they created this huge thing where now there's a lot of these competitors
Yeah,
and a market.
yeah,
So in scenarios like that, how do you assess?
yeah. I mean, I'm not a big consumer investor, so take this all with a grain of salt. But I think we still go back to, like, if this thing really did the thing that they said they could do at a reasonable price, would you want it? And I think for Calm, right? Maybe like consumers don't wake up and say, I want a meditation app. But I think humans in general are like, I would love to feel more balance in my life.
Yeah.
And not everyone can afford a therapist. And so if someone says, hey, I tried this thing, it really helped me, and it's only $10 a month, I think it probably induces trial, right?
Yeah.
And I do think that, like, it's one of those things where people would be happy to share it with others, right? Like,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
not embarrassing
Yeah.
to be like, "Oh, I'm stressed and I found this app and it made me less
Yeah.
stressed." Right? I think that's different from like, "Oh, you know, I have erectile dysfunction and I found this pill and it helped me." You're not gonna tell anybody that, right? But like, there's these sort of methods of marketing and word of mouth that if the thing really does what you say it does, and people can tell others about it, then I do think that has real potential, and it does sort of induce more demand for it. Um, Probably like Duolingo, right? Where
Yeah.
lots of people wanna learn language, there's always been one way of doing it, but then, you know, there's a way that people are like, "Hey, I'm actually making progress. It's fun, it's achievable. You should try it. It makes me look smart."
Yeah.
I mean, what are products that you've been surprised have been successful?
There's a lot of things. The first time that I used it, like Airbnb and Uber, is like when the first time I used it, I was like, "Whoa, this is an insane experience." And also going back to this whole Shopify thing that I mentioned, right? Like, I think maybe if you look at the solution itself, then maybe the market is small, right? You're looking at people who want, you're looking at maybe small businesses who wants to start an e-commerce store.
Yeah.
But like you said, if you focus on the problem,
Yeah.
similar to what we mentioned with
Yeah.
the calm as well, then you see the opportunity, right? Maybe
Yeah.
that's the way to think about it.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's there's so many ways to solve a problem, right? And so it's sort of like, how do you define the problem that you're solving? And is there a larger group that, would use it? I mean, I think this AI, have you seen all the AI character bots, where people are talking to AI bots? When they launched the GPT store, I think like half of the GPTs were just girlfriend GPTs
Oh,
that you could talk to. And at first, you're like, oh, is this like some sort of NSFW use case or whatever? But I think there's this broader sort of idea around loneliness and people feeling disconnected.
yeah,
And oh, here's like an easy way to talk to something that makes me feel more connected and less lonely. And you could sort of see like, oh yeah, like
yeah,
people
exactly.
want that.
Yeah,
That's a very human need.
yeah,
And so if you kind of get over the like, why am I talking to a bot on my computer and just sort of say like, would I want to interact with something that makes me feel less lonely? I think that makes a ton of sense.
yeah, yeah. I think that's the way to look at opportunities. So yeah, now how can founders go about and doing this? When they are working on a startup, in your opinion?
I think it just kind of goes back to like spending time with customers, right? Like if let's say you you ran into some problem and you were like, oh, generally people run into themselves, right? They're like, oh, this is so frustrating. I hate this. But then you're like, okay, am I a weirdo or are other people experiencing this problem as well? I think is to go talk to other potential customers and be like, hey, like, what happens when you try to do this? And try to find like heat around that, right? But also try to understand what is the ecosystems of things that created that situation, right? Is there a reason why I'm trying to think of like what's a good example that would illustrate this. But like um here, I've got one. I have a company in the US. They do chronic care management software. And one of the issues with countries getting richer is like the big thing isn't like you get hit by a car. The big thing is like you get diabetes and heart disease and you like slowly decline, right? So it becomes this management of these chronic diseases. And you could ask yourself the question like, this is such a rich country, like, why aren't they able to manage this? And partially it's the incentive structure, which is doctors are paid to treat you. They're not paid to be like, hey,
Right.
are you exercising? Are you eating healthy? Do you check your blood pressure? Like, so there's like a compensation aspect to it, right? And our portfolio company, originally what they started out with was they were gonna start out trying to help people have higher adherence to their medication. Because if you don't take your blood pressure medicine, everything's worse, right? And so the theory was like, hey, if patients just took their blood pressure medicine more regularly and had higher adherence, you could really improve outcomes, right? And so, the founder started doing a bunch of like research around it. So he went to insurance companies. It was like, hey, if I was able to improve this rate of um, adherence, would you pay me? And insurance company was like, yeah, sounds great, right? Because then they have fewer bad outcomes. And then, so his idea was like, oh, I'm going to make doctors help me enforce this. And doctors were like, I have no interest in helping you enforce that. Like, I don't get paid for that. Like, what? And I don't want the liability. Like, why would I do that? Right. So then that's part of like, okay, you saw this problem. You kind of like, okay, there's some heat around it. But once you sort of zoomed out a little and talked to all the different stakeholders, you're like, oh, okay, I have to figure out how to get all of these other people to play nicely, right? In order to get this thing to work. And so they actually pivoted the business, which was like they built software that enabled doctors to do the monitoring and follow-ups in an automated way, but enabled them to use lower cost parahealth professionals to do it. Instead of the doctor's time, you could do it with like someone that the doctor is supervising. And they made the math work so that they could get reimbursed for it. Right. So doctor gets paid, patient gets followed up.
It's covered by insurance.
insurer gets better outcomes, right? But like it took time to figure out how that works, right? So I think for founders, it's sort of like, okay, you found some sort of problem, but you still need to figure out what's the shape of the solution you're trying to find, right? And I think that's alongside these other questions about like, is this a big enough market? And you're like, yes, actually, the US has tons of overweight people who have hypertension and,
Yeah,
chronic
it's the
disease.
dynamism is the problem here.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's trying to get all those pieces to
Yeah.
click.
Do founders struggle to articulate the opportunity? If yes, like what advice?
I think you just have to keep practice articulating it. I think sometimes founders are so deep in the problem that they forget that other people haven't spent as much time thinking about it. And so they need to kind of zoom out to help contextualize what the problem is, to help that person understand what it is. And I think the more you practice and the more different types of people you practice on, the easier it is to adapt your story. And I think often, like, when I'm listening to someone pitch me, even if I don't invest, I feel like probably the greatest, like, most useful thing I can do for them is just to play the story back to them. I was like, okay, you talk for half an hour. Let me just tell you what I heard in like three
Wha-
sentences. Is this accurate or not? Because that gives you a little bit of feedback on like, okay, how is the story resonating with someone? And are there points that are really unclear? So I think you just have to talk to more people and more different people with different backgrounds because I think different people will respond differently and you'll start to see where your assumptions about what people know or don't know, will become uncovered, right?
Yeah.
Which is like, oh no, like, the average person doesn't know what capitated care is. Maybe I should explain that before if your whole thesis is that the move towards capitation is going to help your business or whatever it is.
Yeah. So in terms of now the execution of this opportunity, right? Okay, people talk about big opportunity, but as a startup, you can't really like capture that at day one, right? So what then is a strategy? It's usually capturing a small market, a subset.
Yeah, I mean, I think one step at a time, right?
Yeah.
So I think there's like the back to our question on like what do I want to accomplish with this round, right? You can sort of segment that down even more, right? Which is like, hey, if in 5 years I need to be here, what are the steps that I need to prove to get there, right? I think so. In the beginning, there's sort of like, okay, can I even build the product, right? Okay, I build the product. Can I get anyone to buy the product? Okay, I got someone to buy it. Can I get 10 people to buy it? Can I get 100 people to buy it, right? And along the way, you're building the machinery that helps you scale those things up, right? And so I think in the pre-COVID days, what I used to have founders come to my office, I have a huge whiteboard and we would sort of sit and diagram the whiteboard. Like, okay, I have one of the levers in my business, right? Let's just make something up. I have traffic, I have conversion rate,
Yeah.
and I have revenue per conversion. Okay, traffic. What are my levers? Okay. Conversion rate. What are my levers? Revenue per conversion. What are my levers? And then we kind of talk and we say, okay, these are the one or two traffic levers I want to try to pull. And here's what I'm going to try to do in Q1. You know, I'm not going to worry about conversion rate for now because if I don't have traffic, who cares about conversion rate? And let's say price per conversion, the more traffic I can drive, the better price I'm going to be able to get because I can show my volume to people and I can negotiate better pricing, things like that. And every business has this, right? If you sit down, you can diagram every business as a series of drivers and you're not going to be able to work on all the drivers at the same time. You're going to look at that and say, okay, here are the one or two drivers I'm going to understand and characterize in Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4. And then once I get it, it's like, okay, can I do this repeatedly, right? Can I go from 10K MRR to 100K MRR to a million MRR? And all of that company building just takes time and effort, takes people, right? It takes trial and error. And so I think the execution piece is really breaking everything down into smaller parts and being able to admit to yourself when something's not working,
Yeah.
to try something else. Because I think often people spend too much time on things that aren't working. But it's hard, right? Because you can tell yourself these stories like, oh, it's not working because I didn't run the experiment properly. It's not working because I didn't have enough money. There's all these
Yeah.
things you can tell yourself, right? But that's the challenge is that you're not going to have endless time or endless money. And so you need to make a decision like, is this working or not? And if it's not, I got to go find something else that works.
Yeah. The one thing that I've been trying to answer, which you asked me, like any company that I was surprised that worked,
Yeah.
I can't find an answer, but I would like to ask that question back to you. Like any startup that you think, initially you thought was not a great opportunity, which turned out to be like wildly successful.
Oh, I would say Airbnb, right? So I remember early Airbnb when it wasn't even like a whole apartment. It was like someone was staying in a room in your house, right? And I mean, Airbnb was founded in San Francisco. So we saw all the earliest parts of that. And I just thought the moment someone gets assaulted or murdered, this business is dead. And I think what I failed to see was like they could actually productize trust and safety.
Nice.
And they put in that insurance policy. There's like $1 million insurance policy for the people renting and things like that. And of course, they've had to deal with all these other things along the way, which is people trash houses because they're throwing parties, like bait and switch and all that kind of stuff. But I think the core thing that I missed was that they could productize trust and safety. I think that was a very I didn't have enough imagination, right, to
Yeah.
picture that
Yeah.
because it's a weird idea. Um, because VRBO, all these things already existed, but they were like vacation houses, right? They're like, okay, yeah, like, and they had like property management and all that sort of stuff. It was like slightly more professionalized, but the idea that you could let strangers come stay in your house, it seemed kind of far fetched to me. Um, but I don't know. I mean, I was an Airbnb host for many years with our house in San Francisco, and it was a great product, and we met lots of great people through it. I don't think I've ever been an Airbnb guest as a room guest though. Like personally, that makes me uncomfortable. Like I would rent a whole Airbnb apartment, but I wouldn't like rent a room with the other people still in the house. That makes me a little
Okay, actually, my first
awkward.
experience was as a room guest,
Yeah.
and I thought that was really great
Yeah.
because I was in Dublin and then I stayed with a French couple.
Yeah.
It was wonderful to just talk to them about Dublin and their experience,
Yeah.
and then have breakfast with them and things like that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think like different people have different levels of tolerance. I think traveling as a single man is really different than traveling as a single woman. And so, I think there's like, what's your comfort level? And you're like, maybe I would rather go to a hotel. I think that one Airbnb totally surprised me. And I love that product. I think it's a great product. What else has surprised me? I think some of it is generational. Like Snapchat, don't understand it.
I still don't understand.
Um, but that's probably generational. Like I'm too old for it. And so you kind of have to just watch what young people are doing. But something like my first boss told me in venture was like, it really doesn't matter whether you use it. If people are spending time or money, you need to pay attention because enough other people are using it, right? And then you have to go figure out, well, why are they using it? Like, what's the appeal? I mean, I think most consumer internet things are they're pretty straightforward in the sense like, are they entertainment? I get it, right? People have endless
Time for
desire for
entertainment.
entertainment. Does it make them look good? Does it help them, you know, dream and fantasize about their world? And I think that's a little bit like these AI bots and things like that, right? Which is it helps with fantasy. But there are non-AI versions of this, like you're probably too young. Do you know what Wattpad is?
I've heard of it, but
It's like UGC fanfic.
okay.
So people write stories about their favorite characters and stuff like that, and other people read it. But that's like another exercise in like imagination and fantasy. And like AI bots are just the like interactive version of that, right?
Yeah.
So, and those probably go all the way back to the earliest bulletin boards. So I think, yeah, I think there's a lot about just like trying to understand human psychology and like what people care about and what they want to spend time on. And can you monetize that?
Yeah. Yeah. This has been great, Shian. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this.
Yeah. Thanks so much. This was fun.